it didn't seem to me to be all that valuable to look back on a life where, I counted how many earrings I sold. And so I realized that to make any kind of real change, I'd have to get an education.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Beyond the Bar podcast. I'm your host, Denisa Tova. And today I have a treat here. I sit down with Patricia Fersch. She's a powerhouse in family law with over 30 years of experience. She is a dynamo. She speaks her mind. And I'm looking forward to this episode because it will give me a chance to go beyond the title and get to know her better. But she's a founding partner of Fersch LLC in New York City. She's dedicated advocate for families in crisis, and she truly is. She's also co-chairwoman of the Matrimonial Lawyers Pro Bono Law Project and a contributor to Forbes.com. I enjoy her pieces very much. Patricia, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the nice introduction, and I'm delighted to be here.
Well, of course it's nice. It's
Well,
you.
that's true. Well,
It's
no,
true.
I guess I wouldn't expect it to be other than nice, but still, I appreciate it.
Likewise. So let me ask you, so what is your story and what there led you to becoming a lawyer?
So it's a second career for me. I was in the fashion business. I had dropped out of college at, I guess, 19. And I won't get into the story because it's really quite ridiculous of how I actually became a buyer for a company at age 19. But I was in that business pretty much, I think 14 or 15 years. And then I switched from being a buyer for a retail chain and went to work for a manufacturer and then started my own business. And it was with that I I'm quoted as saying this, and I'll say it again. I really started to look at my life, at the life I didn't want to look back on. And it didn't seem to me to be all that valuable to look back on a life where, I counted how many earrings I sold. And so I realized that to make any kind of real change, I'd have to get an education. And I knew it was more than just a bachelor's degree. To really do something very different, I needed beyond a bachelor's degree. And so that's literally what I did while I was working full-time in my own business. I went back to college, nights, weekends, summers, and then while I was an undergraduate, I was sort of torn between psychology, and then I realized there was a link in law to psychology, and that was family law. And I was interested in people and generally helping people. And I kind of thought, knowing my personality, I'd get frustrated if patients were in my office for, 10 years and nothing really changed. That I couldn't see that. And what I appreciated about being a lawyer was, although it's not exactly true, the cases are supposed to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I'm supposed to say goodbye, and they go on and live a better life. That isn't true, as I now know, but I'd like it to be true. So that's what got me to do what I do.
What were you into preteen?
Preteen. You mean as a little kid?
Yeah.
I liked let me think, drawing. I definitely liked drawing. I liked theater. I remember putting on, literally, hey kids, let's put on a show, putting on a puppet show, building a theater, that type of thing. I was not particularly interested in law, although as a high school student, I was a champion debater.
Mm,
So that might have been a clue toward
yes.
what I would ultimately do.
Yes. I started asking preteen just because for many people, when they enter the teenage years, they're sort of, it's very confusing. They try to find themselves, um, or they play sports. It's sort of, it's very almost like not structured, but I find that, if you go further back, you're sort of untainted. It's sort of, there's innocence about it. But it's interesting that you mentioned the debating, because I was trying to find a link between what you do now or why you got into law and the experience you had in high school. And if sort of that's why it landed also when you enter that field.
Well, it also had to do with, I went to NYU nights. So it was then called School of Continuing Education. Since then, they've changed the name to, I think, School of Professional Studies, but and we had to do an internship to graduate, which was a little tricky for me because I was working full-time. And I ended up interning for a lawyer who represented kids in Westchester, actually. He also he wrote fiction, particularly involving child sex abuse. But in any event, so I was like his investigator, if you will, interviewing his clients. And that was what really opened my eyes, if you will, to law being more than, sitting and reading contracts or, sort of the ugly side of being a divorce lawyer, if you will. I saw it in a much more helpful way, that it could help. It could change someone's life for the good. So that's really what did it. But yeah, the earlier, the teenage years of being a debater were had that sort of trajectory continued and I not, dropped out of school and whatever, I probably would have gotten there sooner, but I didn't. So I'm not unhappy about that either, by the way. I'm really not. Life experience has some value, so
Yeah, a lot of value.
yes.
Yeah. I mean, those were steps that you took, you had to take to get to where you are. Everything, I'm a believer, everything happens for a reason. You've been doing it for a while now, and I'm wondering, when you're sitting with a client who's going through horrific circumstances, when children are involved, is there part of you, do you get triggered? Although I'm still struggling with, obviously not taking stuff personally. As taking
Mhm.
stuff personally as a professional is not helpful, I think, in
No.
any way, shape, or form, or outside of profession. But do you find yourself sort of sometimes getting moved and triggered?
So I had, so I always worked in retailing all through high school. I was working in a rather high-end specialty store, and so I was always in retailing. And at one point after I quit college, I still worked nights in a retail store, but during the day I was the activities director in a nursing home. And I had the job for about, I think it was 6 months. And what happened, so they were very happy with me and they kept praising me, except from my perspective, nobody got better. You know, and it was a nursing home that had people who had been discharged from the state mental hospital, so they were younger, you know, maybe in their 30s, 40s. And then there were some people who were mentally challenged, Down syndrome. And then, of course, there were elderly people, Alzheimer's and other severe illnesses. And that aspect of the job was so distressing to me that I became extremely depressed. And it steered me away from doing something where I was dealing with people and helping them. So fast forward all these years later, I knew, because I had that experience, I knew that I had to maintain my professional, in other words, as a professional, I could help. If I allowed myself to personally, you know, fall apart, I couldn't help them. And so that lesson that I learned really very young has helped me. But, you know, there are some cases and some stories that are just, they're horrifying. The woman, I was on the phone when I had to tell her, I can't continue this conversation. I think maybe you should meet with me in person. But the story she's telling me, and this is a common story where it's a little girl, 2.5, and the child tells the mother, and this is, I don't want to repeat exactly what it is, but it's something that the father allegedly did. It's a 2.5-year-old child telling her, and it hurt. But of course, there's no evidence, none. There's nothing. And that's one of the big issues and one of the big problems that occurs. And that is that the person who's telling what's wrong or what's happened or what hurt is little, and there's no physical evidence, but they're feeling hurt. Someone's hurting them, but you know, you call ACS and it's going to be unfounded. It's without a doubt going to be unfounded. And I know that. And then it ends up turning on whoever made the report that they're just out to get this father. They're trying to keep the child, negative gatekeeping, all these phrases. And it's really, really horrific when I just ended this call, she's hysterically crying because I'm telling her that if she calls ACS or it could turn against her. And her concern is, how do I protect my child? What do I do? You know, and that's a real concern. So some of the cases are, you can't help but feel, especially when it has Judge Silberman, who retired, I don't know, I think 10 years ago, maybe more, but she had a phrase that something either had the ring of truth or it didn't. And this woman had the ring of truth. It sounded, and her emotion tell me that what she's telling me is true. What happened to the little girl may not be what the little girl reported, but something happened. So I don't, did I answer your question or did I just go off?
It doesn't matter. This is fascinating, and it's so critical because you essentially become a voice of that child that was hurt, and then in the middle of that, trying to discern, you know, what is truth, what isn't, you know, how to present it to the court, how to navigate the system. Yeah, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing with this podcast, is just to sort of show that the humanness, that everything that you have to deal with, it's not about just dividing, you know, stuff. And although some people make big deal out of the stuff and sort of forget that kids are in the middle, but you can tell from my voice that's one of my pet peeves. So yeah,
Well,
yeah,
there are lawyers who are about, slash and burn, and, they're going to achieve a victory for a particular client who may not deserve that victory. That they just may not, because it really may not be in that child or children's, the phrase best interest for that particular parent to be as involved as they're litigating to be. And in doing so, one of the problems with this work is, of course, we see people at their worst, their very worst. They're, and they can be triggered. And if somebody wants to trigger them, they can say things that they probably have never said before.
Right.
But they end up saying, I hate you, I wish you were dead, and the kids are there and hear it, and then it's spun and used against them. And somebody set that in motion. Something was set, and then they hit record. And, it's that aspect of this work is really terrible, absolutely terrible.
Yeah.
And shameful, really. It's shameful.
So true. So true. It's it's almost like people act from their shadow side because they're essentially experiencing sense of shame masked by anger, and they normally would not act like that. And oftentimes, and I was just talking to someone else about that, is you wonder when you observe some of the practitioners, who here is getting a divorce?
Yeah, well,
No.
yeah, exactly. They act like it's them,
Yeah.
and that's, I try to, I'm not gonna get into, a ridiculous war with you. Because when that happens, then I'm not helping the client. I'm not, then I'm in war with this other attorney. And neither client, I don't think, is helped. So that I really try to avoid that, but I have to say, sometimes it's unavoidable. Because you're dragged in, and it's like, you want me to go in the mud and you're gonna enjoy it. I'm not really, I don't like it. I don't like
No,
it.
you just do what it takes. Tell me about your writing for Forbes. How did that, what's
That is
sparked it into-
yeah, well, so I had a client who, I don't even remember, but it was a long time ago. And she, when I first met her, she was actually in drug rehab and in Minnesota. And she had the then little boy with her. He's now a PhD philosopher. So that's how, the years have passed. And the issue was, of course, her use of drugs, but the problem was the father was the one bringing the, petition to the court that he wanted custody and he wanted his son returned to New York. And he was a drug addict as well. And so while she was fighting her addiction, which was heroin, he was still using. And he was actually a writer for page 6 of the New York Post. In any event, the court ultimately, with much help from the attorney for the child, allowed her to stay and continue in the rehab. He actually flew out to see her and disguised heroin in $100 bill and gave it to her, so she relapsed while she was there, but she got back into the program. And then when she finished, she realized that she shouldn't come back to New York because she'd be facing all the triggers. And so she stayed there and got a little job somewhere, I think at a museum or something, and stayed there until she was really ready to return. And so I used to call her every weekend and just talk about, movies or theater or, museums or New York stuff. In any event, she came back and she enrolled in Columbia School of Journalism. And at her graduation from Columbia School of Journalism was me, her mother, and the little boy. And then there was years more of litigation. He was such a crazy whatever. He ended up getting caught in an FBI. He was working for Us, I think it was Us magazine. And he was bragging about how he, hung out with Lindsay Lohan. It was in the 90s. Anyway, that was his job. Anyway, he gets caught in an FBI sting soliciting sex from a 14-year-old that was really an FBI agent. And he went away. He insisted on going to trial. He lost. He gets sentenced for 8 years. He comes out and then he wants to pay less child support. So there's more litigation with this fool. And so that went on, and she became an editor at Forbes, is how, and she recommended me and put my name in or told me what to do or who to contact. And that's actually how I got the Forbes gig, because of her. So it was a client, but I had so many years with her litigating, because he was, he was terrible. He's since died, so, which that's,
Good.
well, yes, but,
Sorry. I couldn't help it.
no, he was terrible. He was so disgusting in every way, so disgusting.
Wow.
One of my favorite moments was in the family court, where he brought his lawsuit to pay less child support. And the support magistrate, who I'd been before, was very, she was one of these people who didn't really look up. She just was looking down at her computer. And so he had acknowledged that he'd been in prison. That's, why he couldn't pay his support. He'd acknowledged that. But I didn't say anything about why he was in prison. I said, I'm just going to play this because I knew it's going to come out. I'll just not try to, really stir the pot. So she asked him why he was in prison, and he told her the truth. I thought she would just her face went from down at the computer, boing. And anyway, he did not get a reduction. So that was it.
Wow. I'm glad I asked.
Yeah, well, that's how. So it's
Sorry.
because of her. It's because of her, and I'm ever grateful, because I enjoy it. I enjoy it because I get to write about what I want to write about. And I'm pretty sure it's written for not lawyers, it's written for everyday people. And it's also written for a national audience, so I kind of can't be New York centric. But my views, I think, are pretty clear by the topics I select, and somewhat the way I might slant what I'm saying, although I'm supposed to be a little balanced, so.
You're you.
So,
I love that. Who did you have a mentor? Would you consider somebody a mentor?
not really. No, when I looked back on what I did coming out of law school, I was like, God, if I'd known what I know now, I would have been terrified. But no, I didn't. I literally opened up my own shop, if you will, right out of law school. But I did have some people who were available to me for help. So a particular woman at Legal Aid, who worked in the family law division. She was extremely helpful. Another woman, I have her celebration of life on my desk. Her name was Peggy McDowell. She helped. Emily Rubin, who's now a judge. There's two with that name, but I'm referring to that. She's a family court judge in Queens. She was very helpful. Dominic Napolitano, who's the president of the New York State Bar, in my younger, earlier, know nothing, I should never say that, but inexperienced years, he was helpful to me as well. So I did have people who would help me, you know, I could ask a question and they'd give me an answer and so that was a good thing.
What do you do on the weekends? Or, well, you know what? No. What do you do when you're not working or writing? Forget about weekends.
I somewhat not so far from where I was as the preteen. Theater, art, movies. I'm not and never was an athlete. I like fashion, so that always, you know, plays a role. I sort of enjoy being or having somewhat of a reputation of being one of the best dressed lawyers in court. So that I feel like I earned the right to wear a suit and, you know, and I also learned when I was representing much less poor people, it mattered to them how their lawyer looked. They wanted a lawyer who looked like a lawyer. They did not want a lawyer who wore, you know, corduroy jacket with, you know, some kind of pants and, you know, they did not want that, or a female lawyer who wore what would be called a schmata, you know, and you know, TiVos or something.
Yeah.
They didn't. They wanted a lawyer who came into court and they were proud. It reflected on them. They were proud. And so I always sort of kept that with me. So that's a part, you know, so I enjoy fashion, so I'll just admit that and say it.
How do you dress when you're not in court? When you're, you know, when you're at home, when you're not.
So I'm
meeting
not
Yeah.
athleisure, so we strike that out. I never adopted the pandemic dressing. I pretty much wear jeans. You know, and probably jeans and loafers and some kind of sweater. I wear real, like what I would call real clothes. And I have, you know, outfits that I wouldn't wear to court, but I like and wear. So I have a red plaid suit. I don't think I could wear it to court, but I don't like to wear things that, you know, are like flashing, you know. I like well-dressed, but not, you know, flashy. Let me say that.
Yeah. You're comfortable in whatever you wear. I mean, it expresses your personality, and you obviously have developed your own style, and I admire that. It's not easy for me to put stuff together and shop. It almost makes me anxious. I try to keep it simple. So that fascinates me, actually.
Well, once you know, kind of, you know, over time, you know what is gonna look presentable. And I'm always, you know, I'm mindful of not looking, you know, wearing something that really is too young, or, you know, there's a certain balance that I'm aware of it. But I guess, you know, from my days in the fashion industry, you know, there's one thing that you can control about yourself, every day, and that's what you wear, and that does have, you send a message, and people, form an opinion or an impression of you based on that. And they don't know how wealthy you are, how educated you are. They don't know anything. They just know how you appear, and you've got control over that. So why not use it? Why not do something with it? And once what's good on you, or what you're comfortable in, then it's kind of easy, because you can just sort of stay in that line. But
Love it. No, it's knowing yourself, and I didn't think about it in terms of a control. That's I like that. What drove you? Well, I sort of have a feeling, but what drove you to co-found the Matrimonial Pro Bono project?
so in 2007, Judge Sandra Miller, who I think passed away this past 2024, was part of a commission. There were many lawyers, I was not one of them, to look at matrimonial law in this state. And they prepared a booklet. And I was also aware that matrimonial lawyers didn't want to volunteer their time. And I knew the reasons, because they would tell me. One was, once you get in, you can never get out. You're like stuck forever. And so I was aware of the things that kept lawyers from volunteering. So of course, in the report that came out, there was obviously, part of it was a need for representation for all these people, is a huge number, and no lawyers. So because I'd been talking to people about it, I guess, for a couple of years, I don't know how, but I figured out if we could limit the time, if they didn't have to handle child custody cases, and there's some other pieces of it. So I drafted it, and I'm not going to name the bar I brought it to and the people that were at that committee, but they rejected it. And they said that they had, we have our own pro bono, but what they had was, lawyers that had no experience, weren't matrimonial lawyers, but they wanted to be matrimonial lawyers. So it was like a training. And I didn't think that was fair to the clients. I felt the clients should have top lawyers. So that was part of it. And Judy White, who was then the chair of the Family Law Committee of the Women's Bar, she heard about it. And she called me and asked and said, Pat, we could do something, and actually do something like that has meaning and whatever. So she and I brought it to, I think it was then Judge Lobis and Judge Drager, both who are no longer on the bench. And then they made one point that I remember in particular, which was the judges didn't want to choose the lawyers. They didn't want to pick. They didn't want to pick. So we had to have sort of a middle person who would assign lawyers. And obviously we had to get lawyers to volunteer. So next it went to then Judge Silberman. She signed on to it. She was then the chief matrimonial judge in the state. And then it went through the Women's Bar, and they endorsed it. And so then we had a big sort of party in the rotunda at 60 Center. And we've kept it going, making some modifications. A few years later, I don't remember which year, because we needed that intermediary person. At first we had a volunteer, but then we hooked up with New York Law School, and they provide us with students, and the women's bar gives a grant, so the students get money for doing it, and they maintain the list of lawyers, and the court sends, cases, and they make the assignments, and Judy and I pretty much, when there's a problem, the student will reach out to us and we'll try to answer the problem, and if, we can't, we'll get a judge to assist in some way, although the judges that were helping us was Judge Drager and Judge Waterman Marshall, and now they're both gone. So I guess we need a new judge, but so far we haven't had any problems that we had to bring to a judge, so it's a partner, it's nice because it's lawyers, the court, and a law school, so that kind of meshing of the three is nice.
That's great. I actually remember I had Judy White on a show. This was a year and a half ago, maybe. She did mention that now that you said it. And I also had Judge Drager too. And that's you are the doers, they're the talkers and the doers. And that is such a meaningful project. If you were, I can't talk to you here forever, but as we're bringing it to the finish line, what advice would you give? I like to ask that, just kind of based on your experience and what you're seeing. What advice would you get to incoming lawyers?
Well, I actually, we have, well, first of all, there's 4 lawyers here and 2 were student interns. So, and we have this summer, at least 1 intern, and we may have 2. But I think, be true to yourself. Don't be something you're not. And because different people have different skill sets, and different people are good at different things, and all of those things can be important as an attorney. So I guess the first thing is be true to yourself, and in this line of work, listen. Definitely listen. Listen to the clients, let them be heard, but ask questions, because, some people, there are clients that I have and have had that I would call extremely accurate reporters. If they tell me something, I can be pretty sure it's accurate. There are others who are, spinning. And so all you have to do is ask a few questions and the whole story, just unravels. So listen, but listen, and ask questions. That would be it. And then, it's really applying facts or a story to the law.
Great advice. Patricia, thank you so much here for sharing your incredible story and being so vulnerable. It's your true inspiration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for asking me the questions and giving me this opportunity to just talk and be myself. So thank you.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. I'm still just processing. It's really so impactful, you as an individual. And to our viewers and listeners, I'm so much in trance, really just letting it sink in here. But anyway, to our viewers and listeners, if you want to find out more about Patricia and how to get a hold of her, check out the link to her bio below. And do not forget to subscribe to our Beyond the Bar channel, and also follow us on all social media channels. And until next time, stay curious and stay inspired.